Hello, and welcome to a special edition of the Liberated podcast, where the esteemed host, Kerry McDonald, will be playing the role of guest. My name is Colleen Horonchek, and I am a policy analyst at the Cato Institute's Center for Educational Freedom. And I'm thrilled to be your guest host today as Kerry joins us on the other side of the microphone to tell us about her brand new book, Joyful Learning: How to Find Freedom, Happiness, and Success Beyond Conventional Schooling. Today is the actual launch day of her book, and so I'm very excited to be able to have a conversation with her today on her own podcast, where she can tell us all about what she means by joyful learning and how parents and teachers can get in on the action. Kerry, thank you so much.
Thank you, Colleen. I'm so excited for this special episode and really delighted that you're that I'm on the other side of the microphone and that you're the one leading today's conversation. You told me before we got started that it's your first time hosting a podcast, so I'm really excited about that. On this really special day with the launch of Joyful Learning. So thanks for being here and for doing this, Colleen.
Oh, I'm so happy to be part of this special day for you. So let's just start with the big idea. What is joyful learning, and why do you think it matters now more than ever?
Joyful learning, I think, is the opportunity that families have now more than ever before to really find the best educational fit for their children, where children will be happy, where they will flourish, where they will feel like they belong in an educational community that is aligned with a family's values and viewpoints. And it's such an exciting time in education, as you know, Colleen, because you've, of course, been covering not only sort of the emerging schooling movement and unconventional education, but also the expansion of school choice policies across the country that make these new schools and innovative learning environments more accessible to more families. So such an exciting time. And I think that's why, Joyful Learning, the book, matters now because I'm hoping that more families will realize that they have options, in many cases in their own backyards that they may not even be aware of. And you do such a great job, Colleen, with your Friday feature at the Cato Institute, spotlighting many of the founders of these new schools and spaces. And I just think that more families need to know that these exist and that more of these programs are continually being invented by entrepreneurial parents and teachers who realize the demand for individualized learning, for more personalized educational environments, and are building the schools and spaces that families really want.
Absolutely. And we share some personal background in common where we were both homeschoolers with four kids. And I think that gives us, kind of a unique perspective on this. And you talk about that some in both Joyful Learning and, of course, in Unschooled. And could you share a little bit with the audience about how your own journey got you to appreciating this first for your kids before you really got so into it on the, in your professional life?
Yeah, such a great question. So my kids have always attended or always been sort of unconventionally educated, unschooled and homeschooled in early childhood. And then more recently, my younger kids attend Sudbury Valley School, which was one of the original, or it is the original Sudbury Model School, one of the original kind of alternative education environments that was launched in 1968 in Framingham, Massachusetts. And then my daughter Molly just graduated from homeschool high school, went K to 12 all the way through homeschooling and is off to college. And so definitely that personal perspective contributed to my interest in innovative and unconventional educational models, really challenging the schooling status quo. My 2019 book, Unschooled: Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom, really documented kind of my personal story as a homeschooling, unschooling mom with four young children who were learning, again, outside of this traditional environment. In that book, I was talking about sort of the growth and diversification of the modern American homeschooling movement, as well as the kind of early microschooling movement. Unschooled really focused more on one particular educational philosophy, which is self-directed education, and some of the microschools and spaces that were fostering that type of education. And that because that was what we were practicing in our own home. And so I was already sort of primed for an interest in alternative education and connected with families and founders through that experience. And then, of course, a year later, a year after the book was published, spring of
Little did you know what was
2020,
about to happen.
yeah, all of a sudden, everyone was sort of at home with their children trying to figure out this new kind of pandemic era of learning. And that was when I started hearing from more and more families wondering, how do we do this homeschooling thing? And maybe I think even more than sort of wondering how to manage homeschooling or remote schooling in many cases, kind of already tied to a traditional school. I think what happened, and I'm sure you would agree, Colleen, from your reporting, is that more families became aware of what you and I already knew, that homeschooling was this incredibly dynamic and diverse experience. There's all kinds of ways to make homeschooling happen. There were these kind of early iterations of microschools and learning centers for homeschoolers, and obviously homeschooling co-ops had been around for decades. And so I think more families began to sort of poke their head up when their local school was shut down in many cases for many, many months, and started to wonder what unconventional education might look like. What are some other options that they could explore? In fact, on March 11th, 2020, that was the day the World Health Organization declared COVID a global pandemic. I wrote in my Forbes column about the world's homeschooling moment. And this was actually before domestic school closures had hit. There were school closures around the world, about 300 million students already being sent home at that time. But in the US, we hadn't quite reached that school closure period yet. And even then, and even when we all thought it was just going to be 2 weeks to flatten the curve, I still felt that even those 2 weeks would dramatically shift American education as more families began to wonder about education options beyond an assigned traditional school. They'd sort of be shaken from their schooling default and become curious of what else was available. And certainly that's what happened. We saw in the summer of 2020 the rise of pandemic pods, were sort of these spontaneous parent-driven learning communities. Many families kind of getting together through Facebook groups and other social networks to connect and offer an opportunity for their kids to continue learning and socializing throughout the pandemic. And as I talk about in Joyful Learning, many of those pandemic pods eventually evolved into full-fledged microschools, either operating as full-time programs for homeschoolers or as state-recognized private schools, or both, as the case often is. And so it's definitely been a whirlwind several years, and I really think the momentum towards finding the right educational fit for children and exploring these new schools and learning models that are emerging is really just beginning. I think that this is the early stage of a dramatic and profound transformation in American education.
Right. There was a couple stories yesterday in the Washington Post and the New York Times, and they were talking about public schools that have closed because of school choice policies. And the tone of the articles was very much like, this is a terrible thing. And obviously it is painful when it's your school closing. But I was just struck by the idea. I mean, do they think that parents should just make their kids stay in these schools that aren't working for them so that the school stays open? And I can't really understand that line of thinking. And maybe they need to read your book and realize that no, it's okay for kids to enjoy learning. And I think that idea kind of scares people sometimes, like, oh, learning can be fun. And they think that means there wouldn't actually be any learning. Do you hear things like that from people?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that we're at a moment where there are, so many more options for families, and those options are steadily expanding. So, obviously in the U.S., most American students attend a traditional public school, but certainly over the past 5 or 6 years, there's been interest in what else is available besides that option. And we've seen obviously tremendous growth in homeschooling now. Roughly 6% of the overall U.S. K to 12 school age population being homeschooled, according to data from Johns Hopkins University Homeschool Hub. That's, roughly equivalent to the 7% of students, K-12 students, currently attending a public charter school in the U.S., and comparable to the roughly 9% of students attending a private school in the US. And so there are increasingly these new options for families. And I just think that we're going to continue to see that because one of the things I hear, and I'm sure you hear this a lot, Colleen, in your interviews and in your articles, that families are wanting something other than kind of a one size fits all educational experience. And typically that's what a traditional school offers is kind of a one size fits all model. And that would be traditional schools, both public and private. They're trying to sort of be all things to all students in a much more cookie cutter way because that's the model that we've long had for over a century and a half, but also because it's efficient and very often cost effective. And I think what we're seeing now is in this age of personalization, where at our fingertips we have so much opportunity to kind of have individualized goods and services that we are expecting that more and more in education and no longer just accepting the sort of one size fits all, often outdated traditional educational model. And that's what I'm hearing for sure from younger parents, right? So, you and I are kind of, we have moving towards older students, or in your case, students who are in
Mine are
college
all
or
out. Yep.
beyond. But those younger parents who are kind of new to parenthood, maybe their kids are just approaching school age, I hear more and more from those parents that they are wondering what else is out there, that they may have gone through a traditional school environment, but kind of look at it and say, gosh, why hasn't this changed? Like the whole world has
Right.
changed. We've become so much
And they've
more
they've grown up
innovative.
personalizing everything.
Yeah.
They've grown up with this, so it makes sense that they would embrace the opportunity.
Yeah, so they're much more open, I think, to different kinds of schools and spaces for their kids right out of the gate, even before they hit kindergarten. So there's that kind of batch of parents who are for sure interested in joyful learning experiences for their kids that are, again, much more individualized. And aligned with what they want for their children's education. And then I think that there's also families who might be really might have really been happy with traditional schooling, felt like that was the right choice for their children, but then something happens, in a traditional schooling environment. And Tom Arnett at the Clayton Christensen Institute has done some great research on sort of school switchers, what prompts parents to switch to a different kind of learning environment. And I write about his research in Joyful Learning, but often it's sort of a struggle or a moment of crisis in some cases for families where maybe their special needs students aren't having their needs met. Maybe there's bullying in a particular environment. Maybe they're feeling like they're not academically challenged enough in a traditional schooling environment. And so there's sort of this moment of struggle within a traditional educational experience that prompts parents to say, wait a minute, we got to do something different. And now that something different is more abundant than ever before and more financially accessible, thanks to the tremendous growth of school choice policies that sort of tracked alongside this growth in emerging schooling models over the past several years.
Absolutely. And of course, it makes sense that we're spending a lot of time talking about the parents and the kids, the families that are embracing this, but the teachers, I think that's something that we both focus on a lot, but a lot of people don't recognize that aspect of it. If you talk to teachers, a lot of times their biggest frustrations are the bureaucracy, the red tape, the lack of autonomy. And being an education entrepreneur gets around that. So what are you hearing from the teachers that you talk to that are creating these amazing learning environments?
Yeah, so the majority of the founders featured in Joyful Learning, and actually the majority of the microschool founders featured in Unschooled back in 2019 are and were former public school teachers. And I remember when I wrote Unschooled, I didn't realize that that was sort of a theme until after the book came out. And I said, "Oh, that's so strange. Like 90% of these founders are former public school teachers," and that's sort of similar to the people that I feature in Joyful Learning as well. And I think for a lot of, in a lot of cases, it's because these teachers find that their creativity and autonomy are stifled within a conventional classroom to the same degree that their students are. And I think that that's becoming more and more true as education has become more standardized, more test driven. Again, I'm sure you hear about this from founders all the time who've worked in conventional schools, that they just they felt as teachers that their hands were tied, that they couldn't teach the way they knew kids needed them to teach, that they couldn't customize a curriculum in a meaningful way, that there was a lot of sort of teaching to a test and kind of top-down pressure around metrics that didn't translate necessarily into effective teaching and learning practices in the classroom. And many of these teachers said, "This isn't why I went into education. This isn't why I became a teacher." And now those teachers can look outside the system and see success from other entrepreneurial parents and educators and say, "Gosh, maybe I could be a school founder. Maybe I could run one of these innovative learning environments." And that's what they're doing. And so, and I think, and I'm sure you would agree with this too, Colleen, that I think what makes this moment particularly profound is that we have now sort of the network effects that are combining to accelerate this movement towards unconventional and innovative education, where now teachers working within the system are increasingly aware of other options and the opportunity to be school founders, and they're able to network with other teachers that have gone before them. Maybe these teachers are reading your Friday feature and seeing the stories of these founders. Maybe they're listening to the Liberated podcast and hearing the stories of the founders and seeing themselves in those stories and say, well, if that person can do it, I can do it. They're just like me. So I think the network effects on the founder side are really impressive and continue to kind of accelerate this movement. And then the network effects on the family side as well, as more families realize that they have these options beyond a traditional school, that other families in their communities are choosing these options, they feel more empowered to look elsewhere. And then the fact, again, that many of these micro schools, learning pods, hybrid schools, homeschooling collaboratives are financially affordable to families, even in states without private school choice programs, I think makes that switch from a traditional, often free, in the case of public school environment, to an alternative environment much more feasible.
Right, right. And speaking of network effects, you profile some networks that have sprung up to help support. And sometimes these are something like KaiPod, where it started out as one thing, creating these little learning pods and became something else with the Catalyst program. So what are some of the resources that you discuss in Joyful Learning or that you've talked to outside of that parents or teachers who are interested in this can tap into so they're not really reinventing the wheel and going at it alone?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up KaiPod. I'm a big fan of KaiPod's work, founder Amar Kumar, and many of the founders that he has supported through KaiPod and the KaiPod Catalyst program. So KaiPod, started during the pandemic as sort of a new model of microschooling and podding that enabled families to have sort of maximum curriculum autonomy, what their children would be learning, aligned with their, values and viewpoints, but have students come together in community with an experienced educator at a physical brick and mortar space. And the first KaiPod launched, I believe, in 2021 here in the Boston area where I'm located. KaiPod does continue to operate its own sort of branded microschools, especially in choice-friendly states like Arizona. There's several KaiPod microschools in that area that I talk about in Joyful Learning. But what's really been exciting with Kai Pod's work is seeing their, as you say, their expansion into this Catalyst program to becoming an accelerator for other parents and teachers who want to open their own type of microschool in their community that's not connected to Kai Pod in any sort of branding way, but that sort of has the resources and expertise and back end support that Kai Pod can provide. And I think it's been over 100 microschool founders that Kai Pod has supported through their Catalyst program. They constantly have new cohorts coming in. And these founders, again, I'm sure you've been able to spotlight in your column, Colleen, are able to very quickly go from idea to launch, especially with the support of these accelerator and incubator programs for microschool founders. Another one of my favorite catalyst programs or startup accelerator programs for microschool founders is Launch Your Kind by Iman Aline. She's a microschool founder, a homeschooling mom turned microschool founder in South Florida, and now has her own Launch Your Kind school starter experience, which is extremely successful. There's Microschool Solutions, which is also doing similar work. And I think it's these resources that make it easier for today's founders to get started and to grow. And there's a lot of sort of parallels, I think, Colleen, to kind of the early homeschooling movement. Back in the 60s and 70s when the modern homeschooling movement really began and obviously expanded dramatically in the 80s and 90s and it's off to the races now in the new millennium. But it was sort of those pioneering parents in the 20th century that made it quite easy for people like you and me to choose
Absolutely.
homeschooling. And it was much more normalized and we didn't have truant officers showing up at our doors the way some of those pioneers did before us, some of our predecessors. So it was a lot easier for us to take this path. And I think we're seeing that same ease of adoption for today's founders of new schools and spaces because of the earlier generation or the pioneers who were starting to create microschools and hybrid schools and other kinds of models really in the 1990s and the early 2000s.
Right. And some of the work you've done also has been about bureaucracy and rules and regulations at the local level. So those pioneers are helping to kind of plow through the path of that. But of course, those are still hurdles. What are some of the challenges along those lines that you hear from founders?
Yeah, for sure. The regulatory barriers. Look, entrepreneurship is challenging in any sector. There are often regulations and kind of bureaucratic barriers that make it difficult to be an entrepreneur. And I think, again, show why we should be celebrating entrepreneurs. And that's something I really try to do throughout Joyful Learning. I'm in love with entrepreneurs, especially
It comes
education
through. It
entrepreneurs.
comes through.
I'm so glad. And then it makes me mad when these entrepreneurs encounter these regulatory roadblocks. And many times, especially for microschool founders and others who are creating these unconventional learning environments, they're meeting regulate or they're encountering regulations that are meant for traditional schools, traditional public schools or traditional private schools that are often intended for very large learning communities, hundreds or even thousands of students. And then these new school founders who might be operating a space with a dozen kids or a few dozen kids, are finding that they are expected to comply with similar regulations around things like parking studies and the curb height in front of their proposed location. Or they're asked to put in, sprinkler systems for $100,000 for sort of industrial commercial sprinkler systems for a location that might be a few hundred square feet. And so I think that it's those sort of frustrations that I hear about a lot, that I know you hear about a lot. And thankfully, I think that the landscape is starting to change. And again, there's sort of these pioneering organizations and legislators who are trying to make it easier for new schools to operate without some of these burdens. I think about Utah and the pioneering micro school zoning regulations or zoning sort of rezoning policy that they
Right.
passed recently that enables micro school founders to operate out of their homes um, or in any zone, agricultural, commercial, or residential, just the way public schools are able to operate in any zone. And that's really being able to catalyze more and more schools and spaces there. You know, one of the entrepreneurs in residence that I work with at the Foundation for Economic Education and our Education Entrepreneurship Lab is Jenny Jones. She's a micro homeschooling mom of four, micro school founder in Utah, and she said that it was the combination of that sort of rezoning or zoning clarification policy in Utah around micro schools in coordination with the adoption in Utah of universal school choice policies that prompted her to open her home-based micro school in Utah last fall. And now she's had so much demand that she's expanding into a second location this
Wow.
fall. So she'll have two locations. She's, surpassed her enrollment projections, and there's clearly tremendous demand there. And so that sort of shows that when we make it easier for entrepreneurs to start and scale their small businesses, we're really able to expand options for families around education.
Right. And I think that points really to, we were talking about the school closures a minute ago and the fear that teachers a lot of times have that they may lose their job. But when one door closes, another one opens, and there's so many new opportunities for teachers today. And
Yeah.
I love that your book and your podcast really highlight that and help people understand that and empower them to move along those directions. What's one of your favorite ones that you've profiled of a teacher? Not to make you pick favorites, but you
People
know,
ask me this, and I really have a hard time picking favorites. But I guess I'll just start with one of the first stories that I profile in Joyful Learning is the story of Jill Perez, who was my very first podcast guest here on the Liberated podcast back in February of 2022. And Jill's story is so similar to many of the founders that I feature in the book. She was a longtime public school teacher in the New Jersey public schools. Then she had shifted into teacher training and worked in higher ed with student teacher preparation. And that's what she was doing when COVID hit. And she is a mom of four school-age children, and their schools shut down in the spring of 2020, just like everyone's schools shut down. And she had to pivot as a mom, kind of figure out how to navigate this new pandemic era of education. And she had to also help her student teachers figure out how to manage remote learning and all of that. And so in the fall of 2020, she launched a pandemic pod out of her home in coordination with some other local families. And word got around. Families started loving what they were seeing. The kids were outside, walking around before kind of getting into academic content later in the day. There was a lot of balance in terms of education, a lot of curriculum personalization. And so the following fall of 2021, Jill expanded into a full-fledged microschool and opened Tranquil Teachings Learning Center in New Jersey as a full-time microschool for homeschoolers. They could attend 5 days a week if they wanted. They could attend part-time if they wanted to kind of customize their homeschooling experience. And her enrollment continued to grow. She was able to recruit many teachers from the New York City public schools who were burnt out from pandemic era learning and wanted something different. And her program continues to grow and flourish today. And so I think that story is so representative of this movement and is also really representative of why I decided to write Joyful Learning, because I was profiling many of these founders on the podcast, hearing their stories. And I said, gosh, if there's other ways we can get these stories out so more families and founders can know what's possible in education today, the better off we'll all be.
right. And a lot of times, of course, for the founders, it's a struggle economically, as it is for any entrepreneur. But those beginning years are very hard. But there are ones who are like Shireen Radigan, Colossal Academy. I love her story, how she's trying to build generational wealth for her family. So maybe you could share a little bit about that.
Shireen Radigan is the one who has coined South Florida the educational renaissance, sort of the Florence of today's innovative education movement. And I think she's right. I think South Florida is really impressive in terms of not only the quantity of new schools and spaces available to families, but the diversity of models available that really, for the first time, families are able to find a school or space that's exactly what they want, just the way
And
that we're able.
the a la carte
Yeah, the a la
options too.
carte, the ability to kind of customize one's homeschooling experience if they choose to find different schools, different programs that are matching their children's needs. And that, of course, now there's universal school choice in Florida that enables all families to access funding for these educational options. And so Shireen is really at the forefront of that. And she and her colleague, Tony Floriciardi, the founder of Surfskate Science, together launched the Innovative Educators Network, this grassroots organization bringing together founders in South Florida, offering support and connection, community, encouragement. And that's, again, these are the sort of the network effects that I think are really encouraging more and more entrepreneurial parents and teachers to hang up their shingle and say, we're open for business. We have this great educational model, and we want others to take a peek.
Absolutely. Now, what do you say to people who bring up accountability and they're worried that in these, very diverse learning environments, how are we going to know that kids are actually learning anything?
So one of my favorite chapters is my chapter on metrics, which sort of gets to this question of quality and who decides quality and accountability and how do we know students are learning. And I think it really comes down to trusting the consumer. How do we make consumer decisions in other parts of our lives? How do we choose the goods and services that we purchase throughout our days and weeks? And it's about consumer sovereignty. We all have different preferences and needs. For some families, a quality school will be a fully outside forest school where kids are stomping in the mud all day and exploring, wooded terrain and getting dirty and interacting with nature, and maybe through that process learning about things like environmental sustainability and science and technology and all of those things. And that could be what one family wants. Another family might want a classical education that's sort of more traditional in terms of the core subjects that are taught in more of a traditional way. Maybe they even want a school that has, uniforms for the students, and the students are sitting at desks all day, and there's no mud stomping at school, right? And that's fine too. I think that we need to acknowledge that, and part of this is just difficult because we've had sort of a one size fits all educational model for so long that we haven't really looked at education through the lens of choice, variety, and abundance, where that we look at choices in other parts of our lives. So I do think that there's that shift in mindset that we've just not been accustomed to until now. But now that we have this choice, variety, and abundance in education in unprecedented numbers, I think it's important to be able to allow families to explore and pick and choose and make changes. If I go to a restaurant one time and didn't like it, I won't go back. Or maybe I go to a restaurant several times and then they change their chef and then I don't like it anymore and I go to a new restaurant. I think it's that kind of mobility and the opportunity to change, to switch, that's so empowering for families and enables them to really find the right fit for their family at any given time.
Absolutely. I love forest schools, by the way. I toured one called the Garden School in Georgia, and every Friday they had creek cess instead of recess, and it was the kids in the creek like playing and doing water sampling and everything. So yeah, it's the wide variety that's out there is absolutely phenomenal.
And then just as a sort of side note too, Colleen, in terms of how do we know kids are learning? Again, I think parents are the best judges of what the best fit is for their children. Many of the founders and families that I talk to say that they switched to a microschool or some other innovative learning environment because they didn't feel that their children were learning much in a
Yes.
previous environment. Maybe they were several grades behind academically where they should be in a traditional school. And
Right.
that's what actually prompted the shift. And
Right.
sure enough, it's more the rule than the exception that in a smaller, much more individualized, much more joyful, nurturing learning environment, these kids quickly catch up to where they would be by grade level and often surpass that very quickly because they have that sort of tailored curriculum and they have that one-on-one attention that we know leads to really enduring, effective learning.
Right. And in the public school system that's highly regulated, there's a lot of kids who are well below proficiency. There was even a couple years ago, like 20 Baltimore high schools, not a single kid who graduated could read at the like even below grade level.
Right.
So the idea that there's accountability there is, not really true.
Right. And I think that's where I talk about this in the final chapter too, a bit about where we're going next. And I say, we want to make sure that we're not imposing this traditional accountability system on these new schools and spaces because to your point, it's not necessarily working well within the
Right.
traditional system. There's so many students that are being left behind. There's so many parents who are dissatisfied. That's why they're looking for other options. And so we want to be careful to really lean into the sort of market-based approach to education that I think I'm trying to emphasize in joyful learning that we should embrace the choice, variety, and abundance in education that we're now seeing with these entrepreneurial educators and allow parents to be the ultimate decision makers and assessors of quality and impact.
Right. Absolutely. Now, what surprised you most writing the book? Did you learn anything that you were really, or encounter anything that you were really not expecting?
So I have chapter 11 of the book is on intrapreneurs. It's about educators working within traditional schools and the changes that they're trying to make from within. And I don't know if it was so much surprise, but I was really delighted to hear some of them say to me, some of these entrepreneurial intrapreneurs say to me that they find inspiration from the stories of these entrepreneurial parents and teachers working outside the system. But they say, that they don't have a desire to leave, that they want to continue working within their schools and school districts and try to make change from within. Many of them are optimistic that they can make that change. And they're optimistic because of the work that these entrepreneurs outside the system are doing. And they're really inspired by their efforts and bring a lot of those, again, those sort of market-based, innovative ideas back to the schools and school districts that they're working in. So I think that's a great sign that we might see more and more innovation out inside schools and school systems, thanks to the entrepreneurs working outside that system. I think we're already starting to see some of that. I featured on the podcast recently, and I think you've interviewed him as well, the founder of the Indiana Microschool Collaborative that is working to create public microschools in Indiana that sort of uh, model or are modeled after many of the microschools that are operating in Indiana that are being supported through school choice programs as well. So I think we're starting to see some of that shift in public school systems more broadly, thanks to efforts outside the system.
Now, any final thoughts on this episode where you're the guest instead of the host that you'd like to share about the book or the people in it?
Well, I mean, one of the things I say in Joyful Learning is that, I've been involved in education and education policy for over 20 years, and I've never been more optimistic or energized than I am right now. I think that we are seeing a tremendous positive shift in education from an education system that's long been defined by standardization and stagnation to one that's increasingly characterized by innovation and individualization. And that is good news for parents, for teachers, for entrepreneurs, and especially for kids.
Absolutely. Well, that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you again, Carrie, for allowing me to join you as the guest host and interview you about your new book, Joyful Learning. I'm very excited. I did get to read a sneak peek at at a promo copy, and I can tell everybody that it is a wonderful book, and your enthusiasm comes through on every page. So thank you very much. Come back here for the regular episodes of Liberated podcast and learn more and meet these founders that are creating these amazing educational adventures for kids, for families, for teachers. And again, I'm Colleen Horanchek with the Cato Institute's Center for Educational Freedom. And you can find me at cato.org. And thanks again, Carrie.
Oh, thank you so much, Colleen. This was so much fun. I really appreciate this special episode and your fantastic guest hosting. So hopefully you'll do that more often and definitely encourage my listeners and viewers to follow your work and to read your Friday feature where you spotlight the innovators and educators and schools and spaces that are very much a part of this innovative ecosystem.
Excellent.
Thanks, Colleen.